Killer Frequency is an indie horror game that gets the synthwave 80s slashers vibe right. A serial killer is on the loose, but why they're killing everyone in this small town is the mystery to solve. We pick up outside in the alley of a radio station where the janitor had just finished throwing the trash, but as he's walking back, he starts hearing an ominously melodic whistle from behind. Hurriedly trying to get back inside, he finds that someone was waiting for him. His screams can be heard all the way from inside the studio by Forrest Nash, a radio host ex-star from Chicago who was demoted to working the midnight shifts in a town with barely over 1,000 residents. However, Peggy, the producer on the other side of the panel, just laughs and thinks he's hearing things. Forrest has been working as Gallow Creek's radio host for about a week now, and tonight would have been like any other, except tonight was going to be a night he'd never forget. He opened the show as usual, intro, greetings, and a Guess That Scream bit where he did a Yeti impression and his barely 35 listeners at best would have to call in and guess that scream. Only his first call came from a 911 dispatcher.
Welcome to 189.16, The Scream, caller. You're talking to Forrest Nash. What's going on with you tonight?
Forrest! Thank God I made it through. My name is Leslie Harper. I'm the 911 operator and police dispatcher for Gallows Creek.
Welcome to the show, Leslie. Are you calling in to guess that scream? As a 911 operator, I bet you may have an educated guess.
What? No! Look, I found a body and I need your help.
Now, at first, Forrest didn't take her seriously, until Peggy said that she recognized her voice and vouched for her, saying that this might actually be the real deal. When Forrest suggests that the cop calls the sheriff, she replies that he's dead. Someone was able to get in close and kill him. The town only has 2 other officers, however they are unavailable and the dispatcher is unable to reach the next town over, so the only option is for her to go there herself and bring backup. Because his radio skills transfer and he's the only one with the equipment capable, Forrest and Peggy are forced to fill in as the town's police dispatchers to help stop the killer from taking any more innocent lives. Leslie tells them that they can do this as she gets ready to leave, but that's when her car explodes and she starts hearing whistling. Forrest has no idea what's going on, but Peggy and Leslie both recognize who it is. The Whistling Man, a serial killer from the 50s who wore a mask. He should be dead. However, with no time to process anything as the killer starts to close in on Leslie, Forrest tells her to quickly get inside and lock the doors. Since the police officer is unable to think for herself, he tells her everything she needs to do step by step in order to survive the attack. He even tells her to take a laser, which she ends up using against the assailant safely to get away and drive off. But with backup at least 6 hours away, Forrest is the only thing standing between the serial killer and his next victim. Putting on some radio music, Peggy tells Forrest about the Whistling Man. His real name was Edward Marshall Mooney. He killed a dozen people back in the day, seemingly for no reason, but one night, which also happens to be the same date as this night, the cops chased him up a cliff and jumped into the water. And because his body was never found, some believe him to be dead, while others thought that he was just waiting to take revenge. Soon they would receive another call from somebody named Sandra, who is on the run from the Whistling Man, but she lost her keys and now she needs help trying to hotwire her car. Finding a manual in the radio station, Forrest talks her through how, and Sandra is able to drive off without being spotted. But about 40 minutes later, Peggy reminds Forrest that it's time for the radio station to run a paid ad in which we learn about Teddy Gallows Jr., son of Teddy Gallows, who practically owns Gallows Creek and is running for town mayor, a true and trustworthy American patriot. But after that, they get another call. This time it's from Maurice, a news reporter who is burning the midnight oil at the office, but the serial murderer just broke in, and now Forrest has to help navigate him out without getting caught. By calling the killer and drawing them away to different rooms, they're able to buy Maurice, who would have gotten himself killed otherwise, time to get out. However, they even manage to take it one step further by luring the Whistling Man into a room with a portable radio and locking him in, leaving him absolutely no way of getting out. Believing that the killer is locked up and the town is safe, Forrest spins another record for the radio listeners. He and Peggy pass time chatting about their families. Forrest lost both parents young and grew up as an only child. Peggy says that hers are gone too, though she mentions a sister she hasn't seen in years. Before she can say more, the door buzzer downstairs rings. Going down to investigate it, Forrest barely catches a glimpse of a person walking away outside, but notices a tape on the floor. Taped to the tape is a note that instructs him to play it on the air. It seems that somebody spliced Forrest and Peggy's words together from the radio to send a message to everybody in Gallows Creek, that tonight they will all pay the price. At the end of the tape, remembering that they were still on air, Forrest warns everybody to still stay inside, saying that he's not sure how the tape even got there because the killer was supposedly locked up back in the archives. Except, that is when Maurice calls, barking through the airwaves that the killer had somehow done the impossible and escaped the room. The door only locks from the outside, so how did he get out? With the only logical explanation being supernatural, that Mooney rose from the dead to take revenge, everybody is spooked. Later that evening, they would receive a call from Murphy, who decided it would be best for him to go out and try to fight the Whistling Man by himself, but the next call would be even more perturbing. At first, all that could be heard was a woman breathing heavily, but after reassuring her that he's already saved a few souls, she tells him that her name is Dr. Sullivan, but then she cuts herself off there and simply says that her name is Virginia. Virginia says that the killer is hunting her. She can't run and she can't hide. There's no one nearby to help, only a frat house down the street throwing a party. Peggy and Forrest come up with a plan. They call the town's pizza place and send an order to the frat house with a note telling the guys to call the station. And when they do, Forrest convinces the drunk, toga-wearing partiers to take their chaos next door. And they arrive just in time. As the party starts flowing towards Dr. Sullivan's house, she calls in, whispering through the line while the faint sound of whistling grows closer. But then she calls him Clive, swearing that she did not talk. Before the Whistling Man can strike, the door bursts open and the mob of frat boys storms in, sending the killer fleeing. Grateful to God, Forrest, beer, and parties, the doctor accepts probably the best tasting beer of her entire life, finally feeling safe with so many people around. Peggy casually mentions that the station has a janitor named Clive, but before that thought goes anywhere, a call comes in from a boy named Eugene. Eugene is out in the town's corn maze waiting for a girl he asked out on a date, only she never showed. Forrest would then tell him to go home to his parents, but unfortunately that was a poor choice of words because it turns out, just like Peggy and Forrest, his parents are dead too. Before he can say anything else, Eugene hears something moving through the maze. Thinking it's his date, he shouts out his location, but that ends up being the worst decision of his life because it isn't her. It's the Whistling Man. Panic kicks in fast. Eugene's biggest fear isn't dying, it's dying a virgin. So he bolts, but his labyrinth of love traps him. The killer closing in, Forrest does his best and is able to guide him through every turn and out of the corn maze. Eugene appreciates his help and then screams on air how much he loves Molly. I love my wife personally, so I can relate. However, at 1:49 a.m., someone would call the radio star, and when he answered, she said he could call her Dawn before requesting him to play her song. But there was just one problem. The radio station doesn't have it anymore, as Peggy, annoyed with the song, threw the record out the window and into the alley earlier this day. However, with more important things to worry about, they just play something else. But then they have to cut that song short. It was Murphy. He did end up confronting the Whistling Man, but the fight didn't go as planned. Instead, he beat Murphy off, locked him in a dumpster, and is now setting it on fire. Contacting the fire department proved fruitless as the town's only fire truck's tires were slashed, which I didn't think was an easy thing to do. However, Peggy has friends nearby, and apparently one of them was wide awake at 2 a.m. and more than ready and willing to risk her life, potentially confronting a murderer and saving a stranger from fire. Finding Murphy inside one of the dumpsters, they're able to run out of the facility before the entire place comes crashing down on them, preventing another child from going fatherless. But there's no time to celebrate because there is another caller on line 1. Something awful is about to happen. A girl is hyperventilating, whispering that someone is hunting them and that some of her friends are already dead. She says her name is Carrie. Forrest tells her to hide in the bathroom, but her breathing only gets shakier as the footsteps draw closer until...
Don't move! What?
What we end up finding out is that tonight is called Whistling Night, where some of the kids in town try to prank others by pretending to be the Whistling Man, escalating things further and further. Carrie even mentions how stupid of a tradition it is, especially considering that one of the kids actually died on one of these nights. But her words are cut short, as one of the jokers still hasn't taken off their masks. Carrie, annoyed by their breathing, tells him to take it off, but that's when everybody there realizes that that isn't somebody they know. Jimmy, the guy who led the prank, steps closer to try to find out who it is, but that's when the sounds of blood slashes can be heard over the speakers. Everyone desperately runs and barricades themselves inside. Carrie comes up with an escape plan but complains that everyone keeps trying to volunteer to do jobs that they're bad at. Since they can't decide for themselves, Forrest has to tell them what they're all good at and which roles they should each take. They execute the plan perfectly, and while most of them get away, Carrie gets caught. She begs for her life as the masked killer starts to approach her. Finally, Carrie lets out a blood-curdling scream, and then silence. However, Carrie speaks again, saying that the curio seller simply stared at her and left, but she can't understand why she was spared when Jimmy wasn't. As she walks home in the dark, there's another caller. His name is Roller Ricky, on account of the roller rink he owns, where he mentions that he just had a Starling 4000 system installed at his business. But then he says he used to be called just Ricky, when he used to roll with a bad crowd, specifically alluding to one guy in particular, and that something bad happened. Bad enough to drive Rinky to drinking. However, he got a dog and was able to outgrow his guilt. But soon, Dawn would call again, wondering why they still haven't played her song. At first, Forrest tried to tell her that they didn't have it anymore, and that he wasn't going to risk his life to get it. But then she dangles something over them, saying that she knows who the next victim is going to be. When Forrest goes into the alley, he sees the masked murderer on the other side of the gate. Grabbing the record, fixing fuses, and heading down into the basement because the door he used to get out was locked, he finds the janitor's secret room. Clive was tracking something that involved a lot of people in Gallows Creek. Forrest tells Peggy everything he saw down there and admits that he thinks Clive might actually be the killer. Forrest also dragged the board from downstairs up into the studio, and on it is a list of names. Together they piece through it and figure out who the next target is. They even manage to call him at the gas station and warn him that the Whistling Man is coming, but Chuck, on the other end, doesn't sound surprised. Instead, he hints at something dark that happened on that night long ago. Chuck manages to escape before getting caught in a giant explosion that could even be heard from inside the radio station. Unfortunately, that explosion destroyed the town's only ambulance. But for now, Peggy suggests Forrest looks downstairs for more clues. The first clue they find is a tape from Clive talking about someone named George Barrow in 1968, and how that was the beginning. Peggy recognizes the name. It was someone who supposedly got drunk and drowned. Forrest would then find a police report from the town's now deceased sheriff talking about how George's corpse had been found by a jogger, Sandra, one of tonight's saved victims, but, going deeper, he would find out more about George's autopsy report. He did drown, and alcohol was found in his system, but that there were also high levels of cortisol indicating elevated levels of stress in the immediate moments leading up to his death, which almost contradicts what alcohol is supposed to do as a depressant and a relaxant. Coupled with injuries found all over his body, including brutal damage to his arm from a car door after he was already dead, The person recording this, Dr. Virginia Sullivan, another person who was targeted tonight by the masked killer, concluded that George had been chased, fell off of a cliff, and his head hit the water, knocking him out, causing him to drown. She begins to mention that his body had been moved post-mortem, but that was when she was interrupted by somebody. Now, what the coroner said in her voice recording notes don't match the official medical examiner reports, but there was also a post-it apologizing to her for making her do this. At the end of the room was a confession from Clive, the janitor, who states that if you're listening to this, he's already dead. And yes, he died at the very beginning of the story. He confesses to something terrible he did 20 years ago. As a result, he tried to save people to make up for his guilt, and that's why he had a board with a list of names on it. But Clive wasn't the murderer. But even though he wasn't the killer, he mentions he had a wealthy employer who threatened to hurt his family unless he kept quiet about the events that transpired that night. After Forrest tells Peggy everything he's found, they piece together that the entire thing was a conspiracy involving multiple people to cover up what happened to George and make his death look like an accident. Back upstairs, they call Dr. Sullivan and ask her about her involvement in George's death. She admits to falsifying documents because decades ago, Clive, on behalf of his employer, used her sick sister as blackmail, saying that he would pay for her medical treatments if she complied, but also threatened to viciously beat her within an inch of her life if she didn't comply. Calling Sandra next, she admits to lying about where she found George's body on the police report because she too was being blackmailed. Soon, Dawn would call the radio station for a third time, calmly stating that her life was in danger. The whistling man was after her and she needed help getting past a newly installed security system at her apartment. However, when Forrest asks her where her apartment is, she says where, but a train, music, and a dog can be heard. Alerted by this, Forrest checks the map and remembers hearing those same sounds earlier when talking to Roller Ricky. But Dawn's demeanor has been off-putting the entire night. It's something in her voice. And she also conveniently asks for a record that was lying around outside. But it is when Forrest asks her what the name of the security system is that it all clicks. Because Ricky also had a Starling Security 4000 alarm system installed. So Forrest does give her a code, but he gives Dawn the code to set off the alarm. She nefariously says thank you and runs off, thinking she has the code to open the door. Of course, the alarm goes off and Dawn drops the act. Furious, she starts shattering glass, trying to break into the rink, but Ricky could be heard fending her off. Forrest then informs everybody in town listening to the radio that the whistling man is a woman and to be cautious. But that's when Chuck, the man who tried to fight the whistling man, calls in to state that he's pretty sure he didn't fight a woman, that he certainly fought a man. But that's when another caller dials in, reminding everyone that there is still a threat of a killer on the loose. Casey's friend Jason had been stabbed and is bleeding out. Since the ambulance blew up earlier, there's no way for anyone to use their personal vehicles to drive out to Jason and save his life. But Forrest talks Casey through how to temporarily keep him from bleeding out to death. Peggy says she knows there's someone trained here working at the radio station who can help them, but that she doesn't know their address or number. This forces Forrest to break into his boss's safe and find everybody's personal information. But they find out that John is a war veteran, and more importantly, a combat medic. Calling him, informing him of the medical emergency, he couldn't refuse the call of duty. Jason was saved, stabilized long enough to be brought to the hospital. By the time Forrest makes it back upstairs, Roller Ricky is on the line. He points out that he, Jason, and George all played American football together back in high school. The night George drowned had been their team's first party. He remembers seeing George there with his girlfriend, the two of them completely in love with each other. Though he can't remember her name, he does remember one thing clearly. The moment that the whistling man showed up is when the party fell apart. Everybody scattered, and that's when Ricky decided to leave too, going straight home. However, that's when another call comes in. It's Leslie. She made it to the town over, informing the police station there of what's happening and is on her way back with reinforcements. However, she says that in order for them to find the whistling woman's location, Forrest will need to stall and keep her on the line long enough for them to pinpoint her location. Receiving a call from a now hospitalized and talking Jason, he explains that the football team hazed George. They planned a party in the woods where the whistling man would show up, Jason was supposed to play the stabbed friend, but didn't know much of what happened after he pretended to die. However, he does remember George's girl screaming. He said her name was M. The M was the only sound that could be made. The power was cut. Checking the list of names on Clives' board, Marie Campbell was the only one whose name started with an M. Peggy said there was a backup generator in the basement, but after starting it up, when he returns, Peggy is not in her room, and it doesn't seem like anyone broke in either. But that is when the masked murderer walks in. The host, face to face with the whistling man. The killer called, and the radio star answered. Hearing hyperventilating on the other side, Dawn says she has a special guest, the guy who started it all, Teddy Gallows Jr. Teddy's father's money saved him from consequences 2 decades ago, but no amount of money was going to stop Dawn's revenge. But Forrest, confused as to why he doesn't see Teddy, wonders where she is. So, she finally reveals the secret. There had been 2 of them all along, which explains how they kept getting around town so fast, how he escaped the locked archives. But that's not all, because the masked man in front of Forrest right now is actually Dawn and George's son, Henry. With the veil lifted and the mask off, Marie shows her face and promises that everyone is going to know the truth about what Teddy did, how his prank killed her George and left Henry without a father, how his corrupt family blackmailed, bought, or beat everybody off in town in order to keep their reputation spotless. While she was talking, whenever Teddy tried to speak over her or lie, she beat the crap out of him.
Listen to me.
You're gonna talk when I talk to you, and not a moment before.
Marie wants Forrest to interview them, to get the story of what actually happened out. Taking this opportunity to buy the cops time to get to her location, he agrees. So, Teddy admits that he and his team hazed George, that they chose this night specifically because it was the night that Mooney, the real whistling man, went missing. They couldn't pass up the perfect prank night. Today on this night, Marie and her son were targeting everybody who was there that night, and everybody who helped cover up the truth. That explains why Carrie was left alive. She was innocent. But Jason was stabbed because that's the role he wanted to play. Although Ricky was an oversight, Marie thought he knew about the prank. But Teddy confesses that Ricky really didn't know, because they chose not to tell him, since he talks a lot. Regardless of what the intentions were, it culminated in George being chased up the cliff, scared, backing up to the very edge, and instead of Teddy just using his voice to say it was a prank, he lunged forward to try and save George from falling, but instead, he ended up causing it. From Marie's point of view, as she was looking up at this, as she watched him hit his head and drown, it looked like Teddy pushed George. But Marie tried to do everything the right way, like a good, law-abiding citizen. She even went to Maurice to report it to the news, but even he killed the story too. In a fit of rage, Marie reveals that they were at the school gym, and it seems that Peggy figured that out as well. Peggy reveals that Marie was the long-lost sister that she was talking about earlier. Marie thinks that Peggy forgot about her, but the truth is, Marie was thrown out of their home by her parents when she begged them to do something about George's death. Peggy did not know about this, but they told Marie to keep quiet about it. Marie scorns her little sister for having forgotten about her. However, the birthday card that Peggy kept on her desk proves that she never stopped loving or missing her big sister. Marie is at a loss for words, but that's when the police come barging in, and here at the studio, cop lights are blaring outside the window, scaring off the whistling man and woman.
Officer Lugo, do you have a visual? Negative. No sign of the suspect anywhere.